Have you ever noticed something peculiar about life and reality? And it's like it's embedded into the very fabric of life itself. That reality is constantly trying to provoke you in some way, shape, or form. There are instances where someone rejects you or someone disrespects you. A plan that you've worked on so long starts falling apart. You lose something that you thought you needed. And then something very interesting happens. The mind enters the equation, right? There's that event, and then the mind enters the equation. And then the mind develops a narrative, a story surrounding that event where you are centralized. It asks questions like, why is this happening to me? Or it says things like, this shouldn't be my reality right now. Why? And what tends to happen is that the mind, right, assumes that the event itself is where the weight of suffering is. But what if the event itself isn't where most of our suffering actually begins? What if our suffering begins the moment we start arguing with what already is? And that, ladies and gentlemen, is something that most people, most individuals are enslaved by, is the constant need to resist what is. So today I present to you something new, a new approach to life that once you adopt, a new sense of peace will begin to blossom in your being, a peace that you have never known before. And once you start practicing this technique or this law or applying this law, you'll watch your life blossom. And this law is called the law of non-resistance. Now, most people will hear this and assume that that's an invitation to be passive. No. On the contrary, it's the most powerful and indication of strength that one can adopt when you're no longer resistant to what is. Now, today we're going to dive deep into this law of non-resistance and how this law can serve you. Now, you know what to do. If you find this insightful, share this with your family, friends, and co-workers, and welcome to my podcast. So, as I mentioned earlier, that there's a mechanism that is embedded in life that is constantly provoking you. And what's happening in that moment is that life is not doing it from a sinister perspective. It's like, this is an analogy, right? We can imagine life being a simulation. And the operating code of this simulation is to ensure that all participants dissolve their ego. So reality is constantly trying to dissolve the self. So I imagine it in this way. Say, for example, you're looking at an ice cube and then you look at water. Same thing, but just existing in different states, right? So most people approach their circumstances, they approach their experience being an ice cube, which means you approach life with rigid ideas about who you are, or about how life should be, or how people should treat you, and what success looks like. So you have this rigid, fixed, stagnant idea about who you are and how life is supposed to unfold. And what tends to happen is that reality enters the equation and violates those scripts. And it does this through introducing some form of rejection, or a loss, or a failure, or bringing about uncertainty, or inviting a deep change. And what tends to happen is that we approach this with this rigid sense of how reality is supposed to be like, We're approaching it from the ice cube perspective. And what tends to happen is that life is going to constantly chop away at that ice cube that you call self, that you call the ideal world that ought to be happening, right? It's going to constantly challenge it, and challenge it by breaking it apart and breaking it and breaking it and breaking it until there's nothing more, until you're going to have to resurrect a new kind of ice cube, or a new kind of rigid idea, right? And that leaves us broken. That leaves us constantly in inner turmoil where we are banging heads with reality. Whereas we can take a new state. We were not changing anything about us in particular. We're just adopting a new change, a new state, where now we approach life like we're water. You see, a very interesting thing about water is its malleability, right? Water is not stagnant. It is not rigid. It can flow in whatever direction. And if we approach life with this level of softness and flexibility and malleability to whatever the moment calls forth, that's when we adopt a new power, you know? So life is continually forcing us to loosen the identities that we've constructed about ourselves, to invite new levels of being, right? However, we cannot become someone completely new while insisting on preserving every aspect of the old identity that we've been carrying. We're always wanting new experiences, higher new experiences, right? We want a new job, or we want more money, we want more freedom in our existence, we want more love, we want better companionships. Yet we approach life with the same rigid ideas, the same perspectives, and the same ideologies about what life ought to be like. And then we wonder why we're always batting heads. There's always inner turmoil because events tend to contradict what we're trying to move towards. You see, we cannot try and aim for courage and still trying to gain identity through fear. See, courage is going to require you to dissolve the identity that was built around fear. If you want leadership, it's going to require you to dissolve your need for approval. You want more love in your experience? Perhaps now you're going to be asked to dissolve your sense of control. And you want success, wisdom? Then dissolve your idea of certainty. So we often approach life wanting to change it and wanting a different life without having to become different ourselves. And transformation doesn't work like that. There's always something that's required to be released. And that, in my opinion, is wisdom. See, we live in a society that honors and praises intelligence, and intelligence has its role. You know, it's the ability to accumulate data, right? And accumulate new facts about what reality is, and reciting that to other people or yourself. However, wisdom is another bracket. It exists in its own domain, because wisdom is no longer concerned with accumulating new information, new beliefs, new ideologies. Wisdom actually releases. It releases your pre-existing beliefs, your pre-existing assumptions, your expectations, your attachments, the version of you that you have so long believed was you. Wisdom takes all of that and it discards it to the side. And that's the very essence of life. Life isn't always trying to add something to you. Life is trying to remove something from you so what already is can blossom. But people tend to imprison themselves in suffering. And the best analogy I can think of is birthed through a Buddhist teaching about being struck by an arrow, right? So imagine you're in the heart of a war and there's an arrow that's shot to you and it hits you, penetrates you, and there's this unspeakable pain that you experience. Your body hurts, and this can represent an unfortunate, quote unquote, circumstance, right? Your body hurts, or someone dies, or a relationship ends, or you lose something. That's the first arrow. That's the first wave of pain, right? That, in my opinion, is something that we cannot avoid. Now, there's a second wave of suffering, a second arrow that comes in. And this arrow is not a physical arrow. This is when the mind enters the equation and resists what's happening. It's going to start saying, oh, why is this so painful? I can't handle this. Why is this happening to me? This shouldn't be happening. I need this pain to disappear right now. You see, so there's the original wave of pain that we cannot necessarily avoid. And then there's the second wave of pain that we create a narrative around that first wave or the first sensation of pain. And we create a story. And this story is usually resisting what is. It's usually resisting that sensation of pain. It's resisting that circumstance that it's trying to change, or it's trying to contest and fight against. And that's where we produce psychological suffering. And that, ladies and gentlemen, can be avoided. Psychological suffering is where most of our suffering exists. That's the weight of our suffering. Most people imagine that suffering is actually birthed in events. That's not necessarily the case. Events are neutral. Despite how things may appear to be, despite what we've been taught certain events mean, essentially at the core, no event and no circumstance has any built-in meaning. I know if you stumble and fall and you land on your arm in the wrong way and it hurts like hell, I know it appears as if there's suffering in that. There's no suffering, there's just a sensation of pain. But the suffering is birthed when you start creating a story around that pain which resists what is. So pain happens, but resistance multiplies it. So we need to approach things with a different level of spirit. And non-resistance does not mean that you're going to remove the first arrow. I mean, eventually you're going to do that so you survive, right? But the essential part is us stopping this process of repeatedly firing the next arrows onto ourselves, where we recreating pain and we recreate suffering internally through resisting. So life is constantly prodding you to react, Uh, that's just life itself. It's constantly trying to get you to react. It's trying to get you to participate in life, right? And it does this through the face of people or through the face of circumstances that don't go your way, right? But I'm going to present to you your superpower, an approach that you can take that dissolves any kind of attempt that life has, reality has, to get you to react. Ladies and gentlemen, that is stillness. Stillness, once you adopt the level of stillness where you're not concerned about how events are unfolding, you're not concerned with how people are responding to you, you are still within. See, life is constantly going to present new stimuli. People are going to insult you. There's going to be someone that you're feeling and they're going to ignore your messages, and that's going to suck. You're going to lose money. You're going to go through traffic knowing that you're late. You're going to have people that purposely disagree with you. You're going to have people that purposely try to misunderstand you. And that's reality testing you through those events. And it's primordially asking you one question. And that question is, do I have the power to change your state? And unfortunately, most people immediately answer or respond, yes. Yes, reality, you have power over me. All you need to do is adjust certain things in my experience in a way that appears to be unfavorable, and I will fall to my knees and I will allow you to change my state. You have that power, reality. All you need to do is make someone say a certain thing, make someone behave a certain way, have things happen that I don't want to happen, and immediately I'm going to surrender my internal state to you, and I'm going to allow you to change it. You see? And this is the loop that most people are caught in, where they're constantly being dragged by reality and forced to feel a certain way. And that's not required anymore. You can't accept yourself being constantly affected by things outside of you. Because if everything outside of you can immediately determine what happens inside of you, then reality owns you. The external world owns your internal state. All it needs to do is push a button and it controls you. However, stillness, ladies and gentlemen, will interrupt that process. And it's not to say that you will not experience emotions that are not comfortable. Anger is going to arise, right? Frustration, anxiety, whatever those emotions are, they're going to arise. But you're going to be able to see it and not be moved. It's like looking at the sky, right? And you see all different kinds of clouds passing through the sky. The sky is ever present. The sky is always there. Despite the weather conditions, we can have an overcast and it can rain and it appears as if the sky is not there, but it's always there. It's always present. It's always available. And it's untainted by the changes. It's untainted by the weather conditions. It's always there. And that's the same as you, the real you. You're not moved by uncomfortable emotions. You're not moved by events that transpire in a way that you did not prefer. You can look at that. You can observe it and be still and not create a loop of suffering, where you're constantly revisiting why this should not be happening. Life is. Whatever happens is part of the isness of life. So when you experience these negative emotions, we no longer immediately turn to, I'm unwanted, or I don't like this. I can't experience this again. Mastery is not controlling everything that happens. You're not going to control those negative emotions, but mastery is becoming increasingly difficult for circumstances to control you. Wouldn't you love to live in a reality internally where you're not moved by circumstances anymore? And I don't mean that they no longer produce emotions within you, because that's natural. You're a human being, you're not a robot. You're not going to encounter your circumstances and feel nothing. You're going to feel a whole range of emotions, right? But those emotions no longer dictate how you're going to behave or the next action that you're going to take. It was Marcus Aurelius that repeatedly returned to this idea in Meditations. Take away thy opinion, and then there is taken away the complaint. I have been harmed. Let me say that again. Take away thy opinion, and then there is taken away the complaint. I have been harmed. You see, we constantly produce a narrative about being a victim to a circumstance, or saying that I've been harmed, I've been offended. And that's an opinion. That's a narrative, that's a story, and it's a complaint that is being issued by your mind. But if we are to remove that complaint, that event has no power over us anymore. It's just an event. It's just an isness of life. Let the event exist without being quick to judge what that event must mean for you, or how that event somehow not serving you. Because if you truly understood the mechanisms of life, and it's illustrated in Albert Einstein's question that I believe is one of the most important questions that you will ever ask yourself within this plane of existence. And this question is this a friendly universe? And the trick here is there's no right or wrong answer. Most people live in a very unfriendly universe. They believe that the universe is unfriendly. They believe that life itself is unfair, that life is tough, that life is, something that will call to you to struggle. But that's not necessarily what life is. It's a viewpoint. It's a lens that you have placed, and that's how you're perceiving your experiences. But reality, the universe, can still be friendly. You can assume that whatever is happening, whatever event that unfolds in your life, despite how it appears, despite its appearances, some way, somehow, it's there to serve you. Some way, this is an indication of the benevolence in the universe, because it's an invitation to the next level. So Marcus Aurelius continued to say that we have to adapt, you have to adapt yourself to the things with which your lot has been cast. So this is also echoed in the statement of Amor Fati from Friedrich Nietzsche. Fall in love with your fate. Adapt to what life has cast upon you. Because in the spirit of non-resistance to this, a beautiful space begins to be birthed, where there's you and there's the event. And you are no longer attaching yourself negatively to that event. You allow the event to exist without creating an identity around it. You know, Bruce Lee had this movie, I believe it was Enter the Dragon, and his sensei asked him a few questions, and I think that totally transformed my understanding. So the sensei asked, "What is the highest technique?" Bruce Lee said, "To have no technique." Sensei asked him, "How do you handle an opponent?" Bruce Lee said, "There is no opponent." And why is that? Because I does not exist. So that exchange for me captured Bruce Lee's idea that the highest level is no longer rigidly dividing yourself into me versus the situation, or me versus this opponent, or me trying to remember the correct technique. It's the dissolution, dissolving the self, where you allow things to happen and you birth a sense of spontaneity. And this sense of spontaneity is what births our experience. It's what creates miracles. It's what brings about things that you could not even conceive of. It was Alan Watts who said that you cannot command the spontaneous process, because when you try to command the spontaneous process, you stop it. It's like trying to tell someone that you must love me, right? That I command you to love me. And that's ridiculous. You cannot thwart that upon somebody and proclaim that they must love you. The more natural thing is for the person, without being commanded, to love you spontaneously. And that happens when we no longer try to force an identity. We're not trying to force a new technique. It's like when I was practicing judo and jiu-jitsu. So with judo, you would use the momentum of your opponent against them. And most people try to use strength, and strength is resistance. However, when you use the technique of judo, it's a sense of allowance. You take the momentum of your opponent and you use that against them. And with jiu-jitsu, what I learned in applying jiu-jitsu, there would be many times where I would be rolling with different guys, some relatively lighter than me and others much bigger than me. And in this instance, there was a guy who had me on mount, right? He was on top of me. Pause. All right, this is jiu-jitsu, okay? All right, so this guy must be like probably 110, 15 kilos. And obviously now when he has me mounted like that, he's on top of me like that, your first instinct, right? The first instinct was to panic, try and get out of this situation as quickly as possible, because it's uncomfortable. There's tension. And in doing so, I left myself vulnerable for a submission. Had my back open, or my neck was exposed. And this was constantly being reminded within me that whenever you're in a position where you feel compromised, that perhaps the first instinct, which is to panic, should not be taken. Because panic is resistance. It's me resisting the situation that I'm in right now. However, in taking a new approach and no longer trying to resist it, right? You become comfortable in that position, and then you're no longer leaving yourself vulnerable. Now you can think of ways to escape that certain compromised position that you're in. You see? And Bruce Lee then continued to give this quote, that I think many individuals know about, and that is to be like water. Be like water. You put water in a cup, it becomes the cup. It adapts to the shape that is provided. Water does not arrive with a rigid argument about what reality should be like, the shape that reality should take. It responds completely to the conditions that are present, right? So we remove this sense of resistance, we remove this sense of panic, and we remove this sense of wanting things to be a certain way. And then we use this momentum that life has brought upon us to our advantage, because it's like a wind, it's like a gush of wind. And if you're sailing on the sea and there's this gush of wind that comes at you, when the waves starts rising higher, and the boat it feels as if it's being compromised. But if you have the right sailor on your boat, then they will use the waves and the gush of the wind to their advantage. And that's what life is calling you to do. Because when you resist, what you resist persists. You trying to resist frustration, you're probably going to produce more frustration. You trying to resist anger, you're probably going to produce more anger. You trying to resist anxiety, you're probably going to produce more anxiety. So we constantly have to ask ourselves, what this moment right here, right now, what does this moment call for? Right? So it's not to have a rigid idea or rigid perspective or rigid behavior as to how you're supposed to approach certain circumstances. If you're like water, you're going to take whatever shape the moment requires out of you. Sometimes you're going to need to be firm. Sometimes you're going to have to be soft. Sometimes you're going to have to speak your mind. Sometimes you're going to have to be quiet. Sometimes you're going to have to fight, and then sometimes you're going to have to walk away. So that's what it means to be formless and to be like water. It's not to have no personality. It's not being weak, but it's to have no rigid self preventing you from responding intelligently to reality. We have to respond and not react, essentially. And that's something that is quintessential in martial arts, and it can be applied in life too. Bruce Lee even said it himself, that I do not hit. It hits all by itself. There's no hesitation. There's no self-consciousness. There's no ego asking, am I winning? Am I using the right technique? No. There's simply the situation and then the response to it. There's no internal narrative about what ought to be, how it's supposed to be, how it's supposed to look. There's just this internal stillness. And in that stillness, you're able to respond intelligently. So that's the new approach, ladies and gentlemen, that we can start taking in our lives, where an unspeakable amount of peace will begin to reside within you. And it's not to say that you are passive and you accept things, like you accept abuse, or you never defend yourself, or you never disagree with people, you never leave, you never pursue anything, and you never try to change your circumstances. That is being passive. Acceptance is merely allowing what is happening to be, not to try and change it, but to dissolve your conception of what is supposed to be happening. You accept that What is happening is part of the isness of your current experience. And then from that space, from that stillness, you can act. Now you can ask yourself the question, what am I going to do about it? You can still accept a relationship being unhealthy and still leave, take the action of leaving. You can internally accept when your finances are not looking too good. And you can still be at peace and act in a way to rebuild your finances and build wealth in your experience. You can accept when someone has betrayed you and internally be at ease, be at peace. And then from an action perspective, you no longer give them access to you again. See, so acceptance is just dealing with what is. It's creating an internal environment where there's no conflict to what is. And then we can bring forth action that can decide and deal with what comes next. Because resistance is wasting mental energy. I cannot explain to you how many times I have wasted so much mental energy for resisting a circumstance. And upon resisting it over and over again, you just start feeling depleted because the circumstance is not changing. I'm in a turmoil. I'm constantly at war. Yet, I'm trying to change the circumstance by internally being in conflict. And that, it's not the right approach. It's silly to say it lightly, because there's no need for my internal state to match an event which I have assumed to be negative. Nothing has inbuilt meaning. I, as the creator of my world, as the creator of my experience, as the God of my reality, I take my power and allow myself to create a space between me and events. I can desire something without requiring it for my inner stability, because I am separate from my desires. I am separate from my events that I experience. I can prefer something different without fighting what currently exists. And I can allow reality to pass through me, because that's what's happening, ladies and gentlemen. Once you enter that inner stillness, is you allow reality to pass through you. Like the sky, you allow the clouds to pass through you, pass by you, never allowing them to modify you, to change you. You still remain the same. So, in closing, the goal was never to create a life in which nothing goes wrong. That's not realistic. There are many things that are going to go wrong, quote unquote, right? It will appear that way many times. But perhaps the new goal here is to become so fluid that whatever happens can be met. Life will change, people will change, things will disappear, plans will fail, pain's going to arrive, the unexpected will happen. And reality will continuously ask you to release the person that you thought you were. Don't be the ice cube. Be like water. So, if you guys found this valuable, if you found this insightful, you know what to do. Like, share, and follow for more content. And to end it off, as I always end it off, for those who seek no more, for in the present we find it all. Thank you very much, guys.